Okay, I'm just got well, first of all, thanks everyone for coming. Really appreciate you all, giving up your Thursday evenings. It's the most valuable thing we have is time, so I don't want to take it for granted. Just by way of introduction, when I pitched this talk, I thought I would do something on, cooperation's critique of capitalism. I fired off the title because it's something I've been thinking about recently in my research. Well, actually, I've been thinking about it for quite a long time. But obviously, it's a massive topic. So I just really want to just say that this paper, in a way, will only scratch the surface, and it will, it's a complex relationship, I think, between cooperation and capitalism, and there isn't necessarily one line of thought on this. There's many lines of thought. So this talk has got to be highly selective in terms of some of the case studies it looks at, and so in that nature, for that reason, it's got to be quite limited. So I'm going to have to set some kind of constraints on it, but I think hopefully there will be a through line that you'll be able to follow. But I want to begin with this image, and it's from almost 200 years ago. And on the 12th of April 1823, a grand meeting was held at the Rotunda in Dublin. The Freeman's Journal, which was the leading nationalist newspaper in Ireland at the time, reported that an assemblage of rank, talent and fashion had heard that the benevolent Mr. Owen develop his plans for bettering the condition of Ireland's miserable peasantry. Over the course of the previous year, the country had been hit by a series of food shortages, and in parts of the west of Ireland, famine conditions had taken hold. The speaker, Robert Owen, was a Welsh industrialist and a social reformer, and had arrived in Ireland in October 1822, landing in Belfast before proceeding on a tour of the country to observe the much reported impoverished conditions there. Now, from Dublin, he struck out to Kilkenny, Cork, Clare, Kerry, Limerick, Meath, staying with a host of the great and good, mainly MPs and landlords. Obviously, some of those were the same people. And he was apparently warmly welcomed by religious figures from across the faith spectrum, even attaining a seal of approval from the great Daniel O'Connell himself. Quite a feat, I think, for a man who was a professed atheist at the time. So Owen promised to unveil a grand idea to help Ireland out of its current malaise. And the great round room in the Rotunda was thronged. All the people then had arrived at the Rotunda to hear from Mr. Owen what exactly his scheme for improvement would be for a country ravaged by famine and poverty. The meeting was a sellout, with reports of men and women fainting and competing to gain access to the nearest windows. Meanwhile, outside, hundreds of people who had travelled to hear the lecture were turned away. Owen himself had apparently been stricken by the flu, struggled to attain the dizzy heights of the oratory promised by his reputation for great charisma and charm. Nevertheless, he did offer the assembled crowd his plan as he unveiled this image. And this image showed what he called the self-sufficient commune villages that he felt should be established across Ireland and indeed across the world. This model commune formed a physical manifestation of what this mill owner from New Lanark in Scotland had termed his new view of society. It was based on a new assessment of human nature, which he believed he had identified and discovered through empirical research, namely that if people were given the right environment and the right living conditions, they would realize that it was in their interest to pursue the whole community's interests and live in mutual harmony regardless of one's wealth or status. Having outlined his plan for starting these communities of around roughly 2,000 people each who would live in model villages, produce the goods they required, food, manufacturers, and trade with other communes for those that they couldn't produce themselves, Owen then proceeded to request the audience for financial support for this work, which proved to be the challenging part. And despite claims of support, the number of philanthropists needed to fund a commune and provide the land necessarily for such an ambitious project, perhaps unsurprisingly failed to materialize. In truth, the support was lukewarm at best. People wanted there to be a solution to the great social and economic problems of the day, but as ever, they were less willing to pay handsomely for this objective. Indeed, the idea offered by Owen raised moral questions. Was equality actually an immoral goal, some asked? Did these new communes threaten already existing economic interests? Wouldn't that be unfair to those who are already producing food and manufactured goods? Owen believed that the benefits that would accrue from his plan would outweigh all these objections, but his optimism and enthusiasm was not matched by the necessary practical nous that was required or the massive resources needed to implement these grand designs. So that's an introduction to, I suppose, Ireland's first encountering of the kind of the utopian ideal that kind of went on to sort of animate many of the individuals who became involved with the cooperative movement in the subsequent years. And just to give you a bit more of an overview of what I'm trying to achieve tonight, I guess I'm trying to offer something of an intellectual history of cooperation, understood as a moral cause, but also something that we do in practice. So this is, I think, one of the interesting things about cooperation. It is a utopian idea, but it's also a very practical one too. And I want to look at how some of the cooperative thinkers have encountered the system of capitalism and looked to reform or replace that system with more cooperative institutions. I guess some of the questions that are in the background of this talk, and I won't say I'm necessarily going to answer them, but I'm thinking about them, is to what extent is the cooperative movement actually a bottom-up movement? There's a lot of talk about it being bottom-up, but I'm also interested in to what extent there is really a role for the state to kind of further its objectives. And also thinking about what is the place of morality. Does cooperation work best when it is attached to a moral purpose? And perhaps, again, this might be overambitious, thinking about what it actually might mean to be happy. And in that iteration, thinking about how happiness might be attached to systems of cooperation or competition. One of the limitations I've imposed in this paper is it's largely focusing in on Ireland and Britain, and it's going to be largely focused in on the 19th century, but hopefully you will see some contemporary echoes throughout the paper. I think there are some. I should just say a little bit about myself. My background is really, I'm a historian of the Irish cooperative movement, and I've looked at it very much in the context of the late 19th, early 20th century. This is largely the farmers' cooperative movement that my research has looked at. I'm not really going to look at this movement so much tonight, although I will touch on it towards the end, because I think there are important connections and synergies that exist between the movement. But one thing that I do find quite interesting is just how central Ireland is to this story of cooperative development. I just see someone's trying to access there. Oh, hold on. There we are. Bingo. So capitalism, what is it? I mean, it's a huge system and it has many definitions. But the one I've chosen as a working definition is the one by the historian Jürgen Kocher, and he emphasizes features of capitalism being decentralization, commodification, and accumulation. Essentially, capitalism recognizes that individuals and collective actors have property rights, and they need these to make these decentralized autonomous economic decisions, that markets are the main way to allocate and coordinate resources. Capital is central, resources are used to increase profits on present investment, so profit and accumulation is the goal. But also capitalism needs its logic to go beyond the economy into other social relations and to influence them. For example, the social relations of the family unit can become increasingly bound up and entwined with the logic of capitalism, according to Kocher. And it's a definition I find quite useful and illustrative of, I suppose, what was going on in the 19th century and beyond. And I'm sure other scholars would say it started much earlier than that. But I'm also interested in the work of Karl Polanyi as well, who some of you may have heard of, who has this idea that, you know, morality and economics are never like too far apart. So thinking about this question about, is there such a thing as a moral economy? Polanyi's one of his insights anyway is to point to the fact that the moment where we have the emergence of a market society, where the market begins allocating resources, we have a double movement, which is society kind of pushes back against that. And that's probably best exemplified, this is a very oversimplified iteration of his argument, that double movement is best exemplified by the creation of things such as welfare institutions, by cooperative societies, basically social institutions that people create themselves to try and mitigate some of the worst effects of a market-led society. So this kind of like welfare, concern with welfarism leads to this solidarity of strangers, the idea that people do create bonds across their own kind of intimate ties of kinship to create things such as the welfare state, which of course we have all become so reliant on in the last 18 months, if not beforehand. But there's also a unified response to what is seen as a kind of the extreme sort of outgrowth of capitalism by the late 19th century, where you have conservatives, liberals, and socialists fearing that the market is eroding morality. Not all of those people, of course, all the time, but certainly there is a kind of moral critique of capitalism that emerges on the left and on the right. And, you know, this manifests in many different ways. There are perennial arguments about what a capitalist economy should look like, how should it function, what role should the state play, are markets autonomous, what should work do? And these are questions about what constitutes social and economic justice, and I think they continue to resonate today. They're as relevant today as they were in the 19th century. And thinking about how cooperation fits into this and to what extent it challenges capitalism, or does it help us? Does it help to reconcile us to the system that we live in, is something that I kind of move back and forwards on, but that's because there are lots of people with contradictory opinions on it. But I think if we think about our principles, I'm addressing us all as the we, as if we're all cooperators, so I'm assuming we are. Of course, these won't be a surprise to any of you then. We have this kind of emphasis on democracy, open membership, independence. There's this idea of responsibility. Members must participate in their cooperative society, cooperation amongst cooperatives, the importance of education, and the concern for the wider community. These, I would argue, all contain elements of a sort of moralistic understanding of our place within the wider society and economy. And I know there might be some cooperators who disagree with that, and I think there's a debate to be had there. That's certainly how I interpret it, and perhaps I'm revealing a little bit too much of my own personal self, but that's how I approach it anyway. But going back to this gentleman, Robert Owen. Robert Owen is often seen, I suppose, as one of the kind of the important precedents in the emergence of the kind of the cooperative movement and the cooperative economy, which is slightly contested because he himself was somewhat a late arrival to cooperation as we would understand it. But we can see in his roots and in his background and in some of the social reform experiments that he embarked upon, how these ideas became entangled. So just to give you a little bit of his background, he was born in Newtown in Wales. He was a manufacturer and social reformer, very much a product of his time. So he grew up and came to maturity at the time of the French Revolution, the Napoleonic War. So there's a huge kind of like social and political unrest. And he becomes wound up in various circles around social and political radicalism that existed in Britain at the time. He had an unshakable faith in the concept of progress, and this is something in common with some of the early cooperators. They had this emphasis on what they're doing is kind of they're creating a social science, so they're observing society as it is. So they have a rational approach to kind of describing, the way that the society and economy acts. They see themselves as empiricists, so they are scientifically trying to deconstruct human nature, and they do emphasize always the importance of character and bettering character, which is a great 19th century characteristic of many of these social reformers. But they believe then that the great insight is that human nature itself is largely something that should emphasize the mutualism and the mutual bonds between us. He also wished to add to the wealth of human happiness. So he's kind of in this utilitarian mode, which is taking hold at the time. He's massively influenced by Manchester, which is kind of the capital of the Industrial Revolution in the early 19th century. He's employed there early on as a mill manager, the manager of several cotton mills, indeed, around the city. He's also exposed to many of the kind of the social and economic problems that industrialization brought in its wake. This included poverty, poor health and sanitation, pollution. And he's concerned with these things. These are kind of creating misery in the midst of abundance. And he wants to kind of challenge this, and he wants to kind of improve industrial society. He's also really bound up with the intellectual culture that's taken root in Manchester at the time. So he's a member of the Manchester Literary and Philosophical Society. And he, along with other mill managers, enlightened mill managers, becomes interested in the connection between health and work conditions. So anyone who's worked in the office in the late 20th, early 21st century, where we're being kind of bombarded with mindfulness techniques, will probably understand that that connection between individual health and working conditions and productivity is still something that's alive and well. I mean, Owen would have believed that happy employees do make more productive employees. I think there's some truth to that as well. But he then marries into a mill-owning family and becomes a manager of the New Lanark mill just outside Glasgow in Scotland. And he uses it as a basis to try and create a kind of, I suppose, a proto-utopia. And Marx, who is a voracious reader of some of the writings of Robert Owen, actually dismissively refers to Owen as a utopian socialist. But it's really the start of his career as a propagandist for social progress and social reform. He advocates some things that became mainstream later on in the 19th century, such as popular working class education. He sees the links between education and productivity as something that would be beneficial to employers and employees. He starts advocating for the 8-hour day, and he implements it indeed at New Lanark. So this creates kind of regulated working time. And every individual human should be sleeping for 8 hours, working for 8 hours, and playing for 8 hours. He provided free education and daycare for the children of his employees. Again, it wasn't fully about just the welfare of the individuals there. It was also about, you know, giving the parents free time to actually focus on their work. He also had religious views which were kind of controversial at the time. He was an atheist, he was non-sectarian. This sometimes actually created kind of problems for him when he was trying to advocate for social change. And he's interested in this question about how to eradicate poverty. So all this comes together under Owen's plans for these villages of unity and mutual cooperation. Here's a plan again, a blueprint for one of these communes that he becomes quite obsessed by and that he was at the Rotunda to advocate for. So there we get this idea then of mutualism and cooperation beginning to kind of take hold. So Owen's legacy is complex though for the cooperative movement. He is influential indeed over the labour movement and influences a lot of the Chartists who were kind of working class Democrats who are advocating for electoral rights, political representation, greater social and economic equality. He's an idealist. He's concerned with character and shaping human nature. But arguably, his critics would have said he prioritizes theory over practice. So he had this idea for communes that would have worked beautifully in his mind, but actually they lacked a detailed and practical set of guidelines as to how they would actually function. He goes to the United States to set up some of these communes. He gets some initial backing, but they all tend to collapse after a couple of years. So he comes back to Britain, kind of deflated at how this great experiment hasn't really worked out. New Lanark remained his greatest success, but it wasn't strictly a cooperative model. It was a business still driven by profit. However, his real legacy, I think, is in the people he actually influenced, which were many. And this actually brings us back to islands. So one of the people who was influenced by Owen was a man by the name of John Vandeleur, who owned this estate, the Ralahine estate in County Clare. And he's so inspired by Owenism and the idea of a commune that he transfers his estate into a cooperative commune in 1831. The profits of the estate are shared by the workers. There are educational there are educational facilities provided for the tenants on the estates. And for 2 to 3 years, this is working quite nicely until Vandeleur, who was a notorious gambler, gambles the estate away, and the utopian project just collapses in 1833, which is a great shame, but it kind of fired up the imaginations of many utopians in Ireland in the 19th and 20th century. For example, James Connolly lingers on Ralahine in his Labour in Irish History text from 1910, and he talks about it as a way to inspire a future, I suppose, rejuvenated island as he refers to it. So Ralahine ended, but in the rejuvenated island of the future, the achievement of those simple peasants will be dwelt upon with admiration as a great and important landmark in the march of the human race towards its complete social emancipation. Ralahine was an Irish point of interrogation, erected amidst the wilderness of capitalist thoughts and feudal practice, challenging both in vain for an answer. So it remains an iconic moment, I suppose, for the Irish left, broadly understood. Perhaps more interestingly, though, than Owen, and again, this brings the idea of the development of cooperative thought and practice back to Ireland, is this individual who I'm sure some of you are familiar with, William Thompson. Thomson himself was a socialist intellectual and a cooperative enthusiast, and he was a clear influence over Marx, though Marx never actually names him specifically. It's clear that he's read his works. And Thomson was a paternalist landlord from Cork. He was quite different from the rest of his class in the sense he was deeply concerned, and genuinely so, with tenant welfare. He rejected absenteeism, so his family, his predecessors had been based in England, but he ensured that he was based in Ireland, and he tried to run various social and welfare conditions on his estate, something akin to Owen, I guess, in New Lanark. He very quickly develops a reputation as the Red Republican. He visits France after the French Revolution, is very enthused by the Republican ideals he sees in practice, and returns to Ireland with these ideas as well. He's also influenced by Saint-Simon, who's a French socialist. And he begins to see competition as something that is inherently evil. He sees this as an obstacle to equality and freedom. And he denounces capitalism and the rentier system, which is actually quite ironic considering he himself is a landlord, and he admits this in one of his most famous texts. And he talks about the fact that I ought to blush in making this declaration. For the last 12 years of my life, I've been living on what is called rent, the produce of the labour of others. However, he develops a friendship with Robert Owen and is very much inspired by Owen to kind of move towards this sort of like model of like mutualism and cooperation and the creation of these cooperative communes. But it's very clear that their temperaments are very, very different. And actually this does have an interesting impact on the way they kind of emphasize different ideas. So we disagree strongly with Owen on the idea of democracy. So Owen is not a democrat, really. Owen is in the great paternalist mode of, he's one of the great men, and he will actually do the necessary work to bring people with him. Whereas Thompson is very much coming at it from the other side of the spectrum, and he believes that democracy has to be central to any kind of social or economic development. Whereas Owen he sees Owen as too concerned with trying to gain the support from the wealthy and from the government. He also is inspired by Ralleheim, and he dies in 1833, so he doesn't actually see the commune collapse, but he goes and visits it in the early 1830s, and he's in poor health at the time, and he sees this actually as perhaps the future blueprint for Irish development, which obviously didn't transpire, and he leaves his entire estate to the cooperative movement, but his family challenged that will, and it is eventually annulled, and he goes through so many different like legal cases and proceedings that by the time the case is finally resolved, there's only a tiny amount of money left, and it's just used to republish his books. He also develops a kind of a very deep and lasting friendship with Jeremy Bentham, and Bentham, as I'm sure you know, is the philosopher probably most deeply associated, not the only one, but deeply associated with the kind of the philosophy of utilitarianism. And he spends some time with Jeremy Bentham in London in 1822-23. And he interprets the maxim, though, of the greatest good for the greatest number in a slightly different way to Bentham. He sees it as a grounding for egalitarian views on sex, class, and race. So Thompson is an incredibly progressive individual, particularly for his times, but I think would actually be seen as an incredibly progressive individual today even. He breaks with classical liberal utilitarianism on key issues. He doesn't believe in laissez-faire free marketism. He doesn't believe, crucially, on Malthusian views about population rise and fall, which is that logic has got to have disastrous consequences in Ireland in the 1840s, of course. Instead, he sees utilitarianism as a way to champion a defense of collectivism. And this is when he kind of links his ideas to Owen's sort of notional ideas of cooperation. As I say, he's more democratic in temperament. But he also understands and accepts the fact that his ideas are going to presage class conflict, and that any move towards any type of socialism is got to stoke the opposition of the rich. So he thinks Owen is wasting his time trying to court and curry the favour of the wealthy, like he was doing in the Rotunda in 1923. So when Owen moves to America to set up his communes that fail, Thompson actually emerges as a leading cooperative theorist in these islands. And it's a kind of the moment where the pupil becomes a teacher, and actually his theories and ideas are much more sophisticated and much more developed. So it's from this point on that Owen took his economics from his friend, William Thompson, according to the Webbs, who were writing almost a century later. And Thompson's democratic temperament, it kind of bleeds into many different kind of areas of his philosophy. So he wrote 3 key works: an inquiry into the principles of the distribution of wealth, an appeal of one half of the human race, which he wrote with Anna Doyle Wheeler, who is an Irish feminist at the time. And it's actually one of the first texts that argues for equality along sexual lines. And again, is ahead of its time, but it's not a coincidence that Thompson's democratic temperament leads him to advocate for these arguments. Again, it's another thing that divides him from Bentham and James Mill and the utilitarian crowd that he has kind of established himself with, and it sees him actually break quite drastically with them on the question of sexual equality. And then finally, Labour Rewarded. I'll just delve into some of the ideas that some of these texts generated, so I think they're important. The inquiry into the distribution of wealth is a critique of competitive society. It's an attempt, as Thompson wrote, to understand all the misery in the midst of happiness. He's looking at the Industrial Revolution. He's seen this kind of outpouring of productivity, all this great technology, yet all that seems to be coming in its wake is a kind of a more unequal society, and a society that has kind of huge levels of poverty. So Thompson argues that morality and political economy, they need to be reintegrated. He's very critical of this idea that the economics as the social science is divorced from what is right and wrong. As I say, he sees the Industrial Revolution as creating workers that are both more productive but also more depressed. And he sees the unequal distribution of wealth as a source of evil that needs to be countered. And you can see in the works of someone like Thomas Piketty, again, in the rearticulation of arguments that that Thompson makes in this very large and probably less accessible book, it must be said. But he's anti-competition. Thompson is arguing that workers had to rid themselves of the notion that human nature required competition to achieve their ends. Again, he's kind of anticipating arguments that are probably more famously made by Kropotkin, the Russian anarchist, who uses the arguments that have been made in the area of biological evolution to kind of reject what became known as social Darwinism, this idea that the survival of the fittest was the kind of the maxim of human nature, is rejected by Kropotkin, who states instead that it was an evolutionary emphasis on cooperation instead of competition in the Darwinian sense that made for the success of species, including the humans. Anyway, Thompson, as I say, he kind of breaks from the utilitarian crowd. For him, interestingly, and I think this is something that I would like to see applied more broadly in the discipline of economics today, but Thompson sees economics as it should be doing two things. It should be realistic, that is, they should be describing the world around us as it is, but it should also be idealistic. It shouldn't just describe, it should also analyze and offer improvements or suggestions or pathways out to a kind of a better society. He breaks with Bentham on many things, but one of them is the fact that Bentham believes that the greatest good for the greatest number is based on the security of private property ownership. Thompson instead suggests that the greatest good is how you should maximize the return to labor. And he would say that equality and security cannot be separated. And this actually plays out in another fracture that between Bentham, who himself is pro-slavery, and Thompson, who is abhorred by it and is deeply opposed to it. His final book, Labour Rewarded, he argues specifically that cooperation is the way to achieve equality. He sees meritocracy under capitalism as a sham. He argues that the free competition between the son of a capitalist inheriting, of course, the merits of his father and the son of a labourer possessing nothing, it showed up the kind of the fact that capitalism was actually engineered to reproduce inequality. Also, interestingly, in technology, whilst technology had kind of advanced society, it had unleashed all kind of great goods in terms of productivity and new manufactured goods and created new cultures of consumption. The important thing about technology isn't what it actually does, but it's how it's owned. So, you know, if it's not socially owned, all it's got to do is force down wages and throw labor into unemployment and further low wages. So ownership matters, according to Thompson. He argued that a new democratic system was needed. Cooperative communes provided one of the answers. And he became what he called an evangelist for cooperative communism. So as I say, he has a strong disagreement with Owen, and he comes back to Ralleheim, and this is kind of, he dies not long afterwards, but this is kind of, this sort of like caps really his career. He sees Ralleheim in practice and says, this is the democratic future that he'd been hoping for. It's worth at this point then, Thompson dies in the 1830s, and cooperation kind of, I suppose it's continuing, but it's kind of a sporadic, it's a sporadic enough thing. It'd be too much to call it a movement at this stage. It's really in the 1840s and Rochdale where things begin to change. I decided I was going to leave out Rochdale, but I think it's actually, it's incredibly hard to justify doing that. So I don't want to linger too much on this because I'm sure this story is well known amongst many of you here. And members of Dublin Food Co-op will know that we adhere to the Rochdale principles. So we as consumer cooperatives, really we kind of are indebted to this experiment that started in the 1840s. I mean, it came about, these gentlemen are the survivors of the original Rochdale pioneers, as it became known. They were people living in Rochdale, which is a satellite town outside Manchester, one of the hubs, I suppose, of the Industrial Revolution. Again, a site of great poverty, but also great wealth. So again, great inequality. But there was another interesting issue, which was around the issue of the provenance of food and the food quality. Lots of food was adulterated. Lots of tea leaves, for example, would be cut with sawdust. People were dying because of the low quality of food, and many shopkeepers were unscrupulous with the products they sold on to people. So the experiment at Rochdale is essentially these people, they organize enough capital to start their own shop, and they start acquiring the main consumables such as tea, bread, butter that make up the staples of a working class diet. And then they start selling them to their members, and they make sure they're not cut with things like sawdust, and that the food is actually has a certain amount of integrity and a certain amount of quality. And unsurprisingly, people were kind of drawn to this idea that there was this experiment kind of like really does like mushroom very, very quickly. So in 1844, you have the Rochdale Society. By 1863, less than 20 years later, there are 1,000 such cooperative shops, retail societies that are organized along Rochdale lines, and that basically becomes the backbone of the British cooperative movement, which obviously still exists today, although some might argue it's kind of lost its way somewhat. But there are certain, I mean, it's interesting to think about why did cooperation become more mainstream in the 1840s? Perhaps to some extent, it was the breakdown of the moral economy for many people. Many people who were living in the industrial centres of the mid-19th century, many of them from Ireland, of course, had come from rural backgrounds to urban backgrounds, so they've been completely discombobulated. So there's a sense that there's a need to kind of create or recreate social bonds. So they do build on pre-existing forms of solidarity as well. So the trade union movement, which is growing at this time as well, is also a kind of a platform for some of this to take place within. There's a strong sense of occupational identity. So the original Rochdale pioneers were all artisans, so they would be considered maybe from the upper echelons of the working class, but they had a certain amount of spare capital that they could invest as well in the shop, but they also had that shared occupational identity that they were kind of working together on similar projects. And there was a sense, I suppose, it's kind of a bit of a romantic shibboleth sometimes, but it's this idea of working class solidarity. And also the legacy of Owen is also crucial here. So many of the original pioneers were people who'd followed Owen, had been enthused by his calls for cooperative communes. And Owen himself was kind of a bit disparaging of the consumer cooperative movement, but they themselves would have been one-time disciples of the great man himself. You also have the rise of Christian socialism as well. So there is this kind of sense of religious morality as well that is shaping the British cooperative movement too. And it's also an attempt to kind of create some kind of stability in what is the 19th century is a highly unstable economy. The cycles of bust and boom are kind of recurring frequently. And obviously the working class are most vulnerable. So the Rochdale societies do several things, but they kind of create a kind of way of members to save. So this is the famous dividend. So the more you spend in the co-op shop, the more you receive back at the end of the year as a dividend based on how much you traded with the society. So the more you shop there, the more you actually were putting away for a rainy day. So it actually provided a cushion of security for many members, which was absolutely crucial in the mid-19th century. And of course, that question of food precarity, which actually played out most depressingly in Ireland, of course, in this period. It did exist in the industrial centres as well, but these retail societies did provide an assurance that there would be incoming food goods that would actually be of high enough quality that they could actually survive. Let's say, this is kind of reiterating some of the things I've already said, but I think actually one of the things that I didn't mention there is the fact that they are guided by principles that provide a blueprint. So it's not just a random association of people who have come together. What the Rochdale pioneers do, which I think marks them out from other cooperative attempts, and there had been cooperative shops set up in lots of places, Belfast, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Manchester, London, Birmingham. And some of them survived and some of them later fell into the wider British co-op movement. But there was the fact that what happened in Rochdale was they set down some principles and rules that actually guided the development of the society. And these are very similar to the principles that I showcased earlier on in the talk. There are some slight differences, such as the dividend. That's not something that we necessarily emphasize anymore, although some societies may still practice that. They also emphasize cash trading, so they didn't give credit to avoid the co-op being saddled with bad debt. Democracy, open membership, political and religious neutrality. It was supposed to be open to everyone, men and women. Again, one of the things that's interesting, I think, on the question, going back to Thompson's interest in the question of sexual equality, is that cooperatives don't discriminate on these bounds. Well, in terms of who can become members, I'm sure on a day-to-day basis there were obviously inequalities there, but it does become an important platform for many kind of female radicals as well. There's the Cooperative Women's Guild, which I won't talk about today, but it's an incredibly important part of the rise of the cooperative movement, the consumer cooperative movement. Beatrice Webb, whom I will come to, she is the first platform she received to kind of give her speeches and her talks about social reform are at cooperative congresses. So it's an empowering movement. This democracy does allow people does give people a platform who wouldn't otherwise necessarily have received one. how can you talk about capitalism without referring to this gentleman, Marx, who obviously is the most famous critic of capitalism? He actually has very little to say about cooperation. The main thing he does say in Capital is he talks about cooperation between as something that showcases the importance of organization as a source of productivity, an idea, I suppose, that he was borrowing from his reading of Owen and Thompson. But it does give an insight into the kind of I suppose, the different moral purpose that a different form of organization can have. So, you know, the idea of the cooperative versus the traditional shareholder model, he doesn't talk at length about, but it does have a kind of a difference in the way that profits are returned to particular individuals in the traditional shareholder model. The joint stock model, maybe traditional shareholder model isn't quite the right phrase. As I say, he says little on the subject of cooperation. What he does say is of interest. He writes about cooperation mainly as an informal coordination between workers on the factory floor. So different working class people coming together on the factory floor to complete a task, and by cooperating with one another, they do it more efficiently, more effectively, faster, and with greater returns for the owners, which basically means that that increase in productivity isn't benefiting the workers themselves, it's actually benefiting the managers and the factory owners. However, as I say, he was a reader of Owen and Thompson, and he does make a statement really in 1864 when he addresses the International Working Men's Association in London. And this is, I think, the clearest statement he makes on the worker cooperative movement. By this point, by the 1860s, there have been worker co-ops, which are different from the consumer co-ops in the sense that they're small factories that are started by laborers themselves, run, operated by the workers. And they're taking root in France, Italy, Britain. They kind of don't succeed overly well in Britain, but they do have a short lifespan. And the 1860s would have been, I suppose, a high watermark of them. And he points to these as demonstrated a potential way forward. He states the values of these great social experiments cannot be overrated. By deed instead of by argument, they have shown that production on a large scale and in accord with the behests of modern science may be carried on without the existence of a class of masters employing a class of hands, that to bear fruits, the means of labour need not be monopolised as a means of dominion over and extortion against the labouring man himself, and that like slave labour, like serf labour, hired labour is but a transitory and inferior form destined to disappear before associated labour, plying its toil with a willing hand, ready mind and a joyous heart. So it's a tantalising glimpse, I think. It would have been interesting to see Marx devote more space to the idea of cooperatives, but he's kind of suggesting in this speech anyway, that it is the next form after the factory system becomes will become the cooperative model, where employees, it gets rid of the master class, where employees themselves self-organize and organize their industry. I'm looking at my time. I think I'm coming short, so I'm going to fly through this fellow, John Stuart Mill. Maybe we can come back to him. He's obviously the most famous of liberal economists, son of James Mill, influenced by Jeremy Mill. Again, you know, he's interested in many kind of issues around democracy. He's a firm believer, though, in the importance of the competitive system, and this actually puts him at odds with William Thompson. And he's a strong believer in free markets, and he believes interventions are only necessary if they will lead to greater happiness. So he's a strong advocate of an alcohol tax, for example. He sees that as would deliver great benefits to the wider population. But as I say, he believes in the necessity of competition to deliver progress and better economic results. The young Mill is formed. I mean, Thompson pops up everywhere. Once you start, it's very hard to disentangle him from many debates. But the young Mill, age 19, at the London Cooperative Society in 1825, gets involved in a public debate with William Thompson. Thompson argues that competition was the producer of many evils: self-interest, slavery, poor working conditions, rivalry amongst people, wars, the adoption of machinery and unemployment. Mill responds with a robust defense of the competitive system, which he remains consistent on this throughout his career. And he believes that competition, combined with the provision of liberal reforms such as around education, democratic reform and birth control, would deliver an improvement in welfare across society. He argued that competition and cooperation both produce bad consequences. That's unavoidable, but at the end of the day, if you do a cost-benefit analysis, competition is still the preferred system. He has many reasons for that, but he does, however, like Marx, have his cooperative moment where he sees the success of these worker cooperatives. And he begins to see in this a form of association that actually can help mankind continue to improve. So he moves from being a skeptic to a champion of cooperation. Mill is actually, one of his less famous texts is The Principles of Political Economy, which was the textbook, the 19th century textbook for economics. It was taught in Oxford, Cambridge, many other universities and colleges. But interestingly, he's often talked about as a great liberal philosopher, but the older Mill actually starts identifying himself as a socialist. And he believes in the inevitability of the replacement of a relationship of masters and workers to one of partnership, a little bit like Marx. And he believed that worker-owned co-ops showed that employees could be effective owners of the means of production in a way that remains democratic. Cooperation leads to higher productivity and a greater incentive to work. But its great effect was its morality, and that it would repair one of the great faults of capitalism. He sees it as providing the healing of the standing feud between capital and labor, the transformation of human life from a conflict of classes struggling for opposite interests to a friendly rivalry in the pursuit of a common good for all. So it's that friendly rivalry. He sees cooperation as existing and thriving within a competitive ecosystem. And competition, he believes, is still the best way forward. And this is a final individual I want to look at. Thank God, you're probably saying. But it's Beatrice Webb, and Beatrice Potter, as she was known, she becomes Beatrice Webb later on when she marries Sidney Webb, and she is a social reformer from a privileged background. She has an interesting pathway into social research. She's a firm believer in, again, like Thompson, like Owen, in this scientific method to identify social problems and their remedy. And she has a big focus on poverty. She's employed as a social investigator through family connections and a reporter on Charles Booth's groundbreaking social surveys of London, which mapped the city of London into its different classes, into different levels of poverty, and is seen as one of the first great works of social science and social surveys into what is actually going on at a kind of a very granular level. I mean, it's completely impregnated with all kinds of like moral dispositions that betray Charles Booth's own kind of like paternalistic views. So whilst it presents itself as social science, it is loaded with lots of very subjective views, and some of them quite dubious. But nevertheless, it's a groundbreaking report, and is actually available to look at for free online. It's fascinating the number of maps that are showing you a different form of London. But anyway, this is one of her ways into social research. She's more famous now as a leading Fabian member. So the Fabian Society is this kind of progressive think tank that still exists, attached to the Labour Party today. But in the late 19th century, would have included figures such as Beatrice, Sidney Webb, George Bernard Shaw probably being the most famous Fabian. But this idea that social reform could come about organically through the kind of the reasoning, the empiricism, and the push for gradual social reform from, I suppose, an enlightened class that was on the side of the wider population. But interestingly, this is kind of like then linked to this idea that Fabianism is a kind of very much a top-down philosophy. So it's about capturing the state and the instruments and handles of the state to do reform, to kind of be beneficent by imposing reform from above. However, the young Beatrice Potter becomes deeply interested in cooperation through her interactions with cooperative stores while she was a member of Charles Booth's social survey team. And she starts attending cooperative congresses because they are open events, and very quickly starts, giving talks and presenting social research to cooperators and later trades unionists, and tries to marry together a project. But it's interesting that it's this kind of bottom up, as it was believed in at the time, this bottom up movement that leads Beatrice to identify herself as a socialist. I think it's important to mention that the co-op movement does provide her with these platforms to advocate for social and political change. And for her, there is a moral problem of capitalism. And her autobiography, My Apprenticeship, is a wonderful book, I mean, it's of its time, obviously, it's quite didactic in parts, but it draws heavily on the diaries that she was keeping. And in fact, all her diaries are freely available online. So if anyone wants to go away and start delving into Beatrice Webb's work, it's all there online. But she says, to state my discovery dogmatically, it seemed to me that unless the capitalist system was to destroy the body and soul of the great masses of wage earners, it was imperative that free competition should be controlled, not exceptionally or spasmodically, but universally, so as to ensure to everyone a prescribed national minimum of civilized life. So this is something that she, I guess, is kind of like her main motivation. She wants to create a national minimum, what we might call a welfare state now, I guess. But she sees this as coming through the cooperative movement, basically. She sees it as an important part of that new type of, better type of society. One of her mentors, Herbert Spencer, is one of the people who would be identified as a social Darwinist. He always emphasized that the profit-making motive and the profit-making enterprise was the one that was the natural order of things. But she rejects this. So this is one of her kind of great moments of awakening, where she rejects Herbert Spencer's teaching on these issues. She attends the cooperative congresses, becomes deeply interested in cooperation and socialism. And she argues that cooperation promotes an ideal that was the peaceful elimination of the capitalist entrepreneur. That's what she believes cooperation was supposed to achieve. She also observed, though, that consumer co-ops, which was the main body, the Rochdale model was the mainstream association by this point, did require democracies of workers as well to form a truly cooperative society. But this wasn't necessarily the worker cooperative movement, which had sprang up in the 1860s. Instead, she saw this as actually being closer and akin to the trade union movement. And she starts advocating that, you know, to create a kind of a municipal form of socialism that creates a kind of a socialist form of state action, you need an enlightened state, but you also then need a workers' democracy, which is trade unionism, and you also need a consumers' democracy, which is the cooperative movement. So she rejects the idea that capitalism was the main form of wealth creation. She points to things like state forests, mines, post offices, municipally owned utilities, and cooperatives. It represented an important branch of democracy, which was the proper relationship of trade unionism and cooperation is that of an ideal marriage in which each partner respects the individuality and assists the work of the other, whilst both cordially join forces to secure their common end, which is the cooperative state. She does see a problem, though, with the worker co-op model, which she says worker co-ops aren't able to adapt because they're too embedded with their own practices and their own forms of production. So they won't adapt new technologies to reflect the needs and desires of consumers. Therefore, workers need the consumer cooperative movement in order to, so that intelligence could be relayed back to them. The consumer cooperative movement is superior in this point because it is actually more democratic, because it tells workers what it is they need to be doing. Kind of a slightly, I suppose I'm kind of ambiguous about that, but still, it's an interesting one. And going back to bringing this things to a conclusion now, it comes back to Ireland. Horace Plunkett, who is the leader of the Irish co-op movement that starts in the 1880s, 1890s. Beatrice Potter is one of his chief influences. He goes over in 1889, after he returns from the United States, to the Cooperative Congress, where he meets Beatrice Potter, who fills him full of like enthusiasm and, you know, with lots of ideas about why cooperation is so good and how we should apply it to Ireland. So Plunkett returns to start an Irish co-op movement, initially based around consumption and consumers, but that fails because of the kind of the strong, as they become known, the Gombeen men, the kind of the strong shopkeepers, the kind of are well organized. So he moves and shifts very quickly to the producer, the farmer, and settles on agricultural production as a model of cooperation to promote. And this has long-term consequences, as it is a producer-led model that is a dominant form in Ireland and remains so to today. But interestingly, Plunkett also then tries to emulate the Fabian experiment, and is actually quite successful at doing that. He creates an organization called the Plunkett Foundation, which actually attracts cooperators from around the world, places from India, Australia, the United States, Denmark, wherever. They come, Japan, they come to Ireland to study cooperation. Beatrice Webb herself comes over as well, and is a frequent visitor to Plunkett's house in Foxrock. But the Plunkett Foundation relocates to England in 1923 when the IRA burned Plunkett's house down. And I think it's kind of one of those lost moments, really, in what ifs in Irish cooperative history, of that kind of think tank of cooperators and knowledge had stayed in Ireland. but sadly was lost to us. I think there's something to be mourned and hopefully replaced at some point. Also in Ireland, cooperative ideas become bound up with the church critique of capitalism, which I'll skip over actually because it's probably bringing us somewhere else. But I'll end actually with the idea of Ralligheim. It kind of did George Russell AE, who was the right-hand man to Plunkett. He's kind of the main propagandist for the Irish cooperative movement. He's approaching it very much, he's in the Thompsonite mold, I would say. He's very much the idealist. They worked well together because Plunkett would have been the more realistic. He was kind of wanting to create a form of democratic entrepreneurship in the Irish countryside, whereas Russell was really aiming for the creation of a whole new Irish civilization. So that's kind of a very modest ambition to aim at. But in 1920, I suppose at the height of the Irish Revolution, he returns to Ralligheim as the thing that should actually mobilize and inspire future Irish people as they look to build whatever an independent Ireland might look like. And he says, I think it is possible that the soul of Ralligheim may reincarnate speedily in modern Ireland, where people now talk almost as much about cooperation as about Sinn Féin. They are now better prepared for communal activity. And I suppose in a time when Sinn Féin are being talked about a lot, it would also be nice if we all talked about cooperation a bit more as well. So I'll draw it to a conclusion there. And if anyone has any questions, I'll try and answer them. Thanks. Hope that made sense. I was scribbling it on the train last night as I was coming back from Limerick. So
yeah, that's been fascinating, Patrick. It's a sort of crash course in the history of the cooperative movement. It's fascinating to learn about that it was really quite kind of that the role of the cooperatives were, I guess they were also part of the debate about, with liberals as well, with engaged with Bentham and Mill and all of these around what was the how we should organize society. It's something I think it's something that is maybe kind of sort of forgotten today,
I was kind of surprised to learn about, because the roots of utilitarianism, I guess I've always had from my undergraduate days, the idea that utilitarianism is about the promotion of a kind of a liberal individual subject, and it's about how you maximize an individual's liberty. And to see Thompson, who always described himself as a utilitarian, have a very collectivist reading of it. And that basically coming out of this form of cooperative political economy, I found really empowering in his way, because I think the problem that cooperators probably do have is we draw on so many different varieties of thought. And I think that's great. It is one of our strengths. But to try and create a kind of a coherent body of work around cooperation, I mean, I only I tried to create a link between the few people I talked today, but I'm also very much aware that I was looking at it in a very parochial sense. I mean, just very much focused on these islands. But that kind of, I suppose, plurality of thought that goes into the cooperative project is a strength, but it can also be the thing that obscures a lot of what's going on. It can make it almost seem like too complex a project to try and study, because there are so many people coming from such different perspectives.
Is there anyone who has any other questions? Anyone else like to ask a question? Do you want to just go for it? Oh, very quiet. I mean, another element was the involvement, the role of women throughout, really, in terms of building the cooperative movement and the relationship with an emergent feminist sort of feminist perspective as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense, right, that people who are genuine Democrats believe that all individuals have equal worth, or they should do. So, I mean, but it shouldn't be surprising, but of course it is surprising, because you know, it took so long for that legislation to actually come through. But again, Thompson, when I wrote that book about the Irish cooperative movement, I really did start it in the late 19th century. And I suppose if I was to go back to do it, I'd have to try and embed Thompson in it much better, because he's a man who's so far ahead of his time, I think, really. And as it was alluded to, he has a lot to say for us still today. But again, though, I mean, he presented the book he wrote on, you know, sexual equality, which he co-authored with Anna Wheeler Doyle, who I'd like to think might be a potential relative of mine. You know, she wasn't actually publicly credited either, although he did publicly say that she did co-write this. I mean, it is just Thompson's name on the text. So I think it's important still to remember that whilst, you know, the cooperative movement has kind of provided a platform for women in the past, there were still like inequalities built into it. And of course, you know, we've all attended meetings at cooperative and non-cooperative, and there'll always be like voices that speak more, I suppose. But you know, I suppose it's still, though, it's important to see that kind of democratic project wasn't just about selling unadulterated food. It didn't just have to one. It might have brought people together as a common bond around one specific interest, but it kind of organically sort of blossoms out into a whole host of other questions.
And these while the focus here is on the Irish connection, in a way, this was kind of the early years of what became an international movement. And you know, cooperatives have really established themselves in many countries around the world. So were they part? Did they, you know, Owen, Thompson, were they traveling, and was there this sort of international dimension to what was going on as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the history of the cooperative movement, I find, is incredibly local and incredibly international. And it is incredibly national as well, but I think actually the local and the international are more interesting lenses to think about it. So I just mentioned there towards the end that when we look at the Irish context, the whole thing becomes known at the time as plunketism, but there are people coming from around the world to study it. I mean, this is one of those things that really places Ireland at the heart of like international modernity, that people come to Ireland to understand how can we perfect this social system, and we kind of lose that during the Civil War, which I think is one of those, I think is incredibly sad. But you know, in 1895 you had the creation of the International Cooperative Alliance, so there's very clearly an impetus to try and institutionalize cooperators as an international community. But cooperators they're a very transnational group of experts, so they do travel around and they study cooperation in other contexts. So again, Plunkett, after going to the Cooperative Congress in Britain, heads out to Denmark to study what cooperative farmers are doing. Americans, as I say, come to Ireland to study that. And the 1913, the American Congress sends actually an exploration to study cooperation across Europe. They write this huge report and survey, and they can like bring back ideas about how they can institutionalize a cooperative experiment there themselves, which they actually do. You know, it's one of the things that we think about America as a great kind of capitalist heartland, but actually it's actually, as I'm sure you know, it's one of those interesting case studies. It has that double movement, which is capitalism, but then this kind of massive social economy that's kind of born out of necessity in many respects, but it's a cooperative model that is kind of gives it its shape, I suppose. So yeah, you do have these international debates. Again, 1864 with Marx, he's addressing the International Working Men's Association. I suppose the thing is that there's so many disagreements between cooperators themselves. So in Britain, it's probably best exemplified. So you have the producers co-ops, you have the worker co-ops, and you have the consumer co-ops. And quite often they don't cooperate with each other. They kind of identify each other as competitors. So congresses sometimes, and Beatrice Potter talks about this quite a bit, it becomes quite interminable, where you have different people speaking about their different ideas about what the cooperative commonwealth should be, and they don't necessarily get along. And the consumer wins out there. And yeah, there's kind of a tension, I guess, that exists.
Jane, you had your hand up there a minute ago.
Hi, Kevin. Hi, Patty. I did have my hand up, but actually, the question that I was going to ask was kind of subsumed into your last one, and it was about like the concurrent timelines of the cooperative movement across different countries and cultures. So yeah, thank you.
I hope I answered it. I don't know. It sounded like it might have been a slightly different question.
No, I think you did. Aye.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm curious. I'm curious how many of our participants here are members of cooperatives. A few. Yeah, I think there's only 8 of us on. There's only 8 of us on videos at the moment, but I'm guessing that there's a few more in the chat there as well.
I think Victor has his hand up.
Yes, Patrick. First of all, thank you so much for your presentation. That was a real tour de force of the historical perspective, obviously, but really from the philosophical point of view. I really found that interesting how you bring everything together and tie Ireland into the international context, particularly in the 19th century. I'd like to ask more of a future-looking question, if that's okay. It was a post-general election take on the Irish parties and co-op policy. And I was wondering from a legislative or even a regulatory point of view, as opposed to what the co-op movement could do itself, but from a legislative point of view, what would be on your wish list for policies that a future Irish government could introduce that could support and foster the co-op movement? It's an area that I haven't seen much work on, particularly in an Irish context, although I'm first to admit that I may not be looking in the right places.
Okay, yeah, I think I got that. I'm not always sure whether a historian is the best person to answer these types of questions, but I guess so. There are some things, though, that I mean, you know, I'm a cooperator as well, so we, you know, I have some of these debates with esteemed cooperators like Kevin there, and you know, there are a few things that I've picked up from others. So this isn't anything original from my point of view, but I suppose there are some key areas in an Irish context first, but it's not just an Irish problem. But you know, there's one around housing. And there is an organisation called Cooperative Housing Ireland, but and Amy will know again a lot more about this than me. But cooperative housing is such like a tiny mix of the housing options we have here in Ireland. So thinking about how we can mainstream cooperation within housing would actually be worthwhile. I know we had the Housing for All report there last week, but despite the kind of input from cooperators and Cooperative Housing Ireland, there seems to be like no real mention or any substantial support for the cooperative housing sector. In fact, I would say even more pernicious than that, and this is, I could be corrected here. Cooperative housing that does exist in Ireland actually seems designed almost to kind of very, very quickly make its way into the more lucrative private developer end of the market. So there have been cases where co-op housing can't be resold as co-op housing, which usually means it's originally sold off as below market value. Now, there are more than one way to organize cooperative housing than just create a building to sell under the market value. But there have been occasions then where those houses are sold on and taken out of the cooperative stock and moved into the private market, probably bought up by some institutional investor. So I suppose actually using cooperative housing as an important option. And I look at Scotland, for example, there you have in Edinburgh, the student housing cooperative, which has actually been quite successful in kind of bringing tenancies to students in the city centre at an affordable cost. So there's actually benefits to students and kind of creates a nice non-commodified or less commodified housing resource and option for students, because, wherever there's a university, you need to house students, and that can create resentment amongst local populations. But if you actually had proper public housing, it might not create as much tension as it sometimes does. Credit unions are the other great kind of cooperative movement across this island. Again, speaking to people who are involved in credit unions, there's a lot of money there that can't be used to social purposes, even if their credit union members themselves would like to see funds released for that purpose. So there's too much regulation around the credit union sector, and this goes back to the financial crash. So when the banking sector was regulated, the Central Bank of Ireland also regulated credit unions, even though the credit union movement was actually something quite separate and distinct. But nevertheless, they've kind of really been tied up in all kinds of legislation, which means they can't do things that could actually be socially beneficial. And I guess I'm ranting now, but like I think it was 2013, 2014, the credit union movement tried to put together a bond that they offered the government, and they would use that bond to build cheap public housing. It was almost as good as a state bond because they had the resources there to back it up, but the government refused to use the bond, which was being offered as a gift, essentially. So that just didn't happen. So I think a lot of this is about political imagination. So you can design as much legislation as you want, but I think unless there is a political will or political education amongst our policymakers that the cooperative option exists and is actually very vibrant, rather than it get rolled out as a way to kind of often be thrown under the bus, which is kind of what happened in the UK when the banking sector collapsed. The cooperative bank, which isn't fully cooperative, I understand, was basically encouraged to take on bad assets and is now owned by hedge funds. So, it's about political education, even amongst our political class. And just kind of, I don't think this stuff really needs legislation, it just needs kind of political will or a movement away from ignorance. But yeah, I'll stop ranting now.
Thanks very much, Patrick.
Okay, that's great. Any final questions? We'll let Patrick. You've had a long day working, and so thank you very much for really interesting deep dive into the history of cooperatives and the Irish connection as well. Okay, thank you everyone for coming along. Hopefully there are just to let you know that there are some other upcoming events for the community development program. Next week we have an introduction to permaculture. There will also be a visit to the High Bank Orchard. So that's a local farm visit with Dublin Food Co-op. And the week after that, we're going to have a discussion with Sean McCabe from Task on the people's-led transition. So the role of cooperatives in adapting to climate change. So some interesting events upcoming, and we hope you can join us again. So thank you all again for coming along this evening, and thank you, Patrick. Have a good evening. Bye bye.
Yeah, thanks for coming along, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye.